Everybody, Andy here again. This is hopefully going to be a quick response to kenrg's video, which I've literally just watched, The Day the Music Died. And what Ken was talking about in there was about 8th of December 1980, the day that John Lennon was killed, assassinated, murdered, whichever term you want to use, over there at the Dakota buildings in New York City. And Ken relayed his own personal story, and obviously this will be a response to that if he's down there or wherever it might be. I thought I'd relay mine. Funnily enough, over the past few years, there's been a little tradition of videos coming out on YouTube that I've done, and I know that other people, good friends of mine on here, and big musical fans as well on here, and big Beatles fans, that have put videos up. And I'll be perfectly honest, I had forgotten all about this terrible anniversary until I was reminded about it by a tweet from somebody earlier on. And then you think, wow, yeah, it's just, for me, it's partly because the way that this year's gone, it's just flown by. But my own experiences, Ken was working in a record store, and he heard it when he got home that night. For myself, being here in the UK, I heard about it the following morning, and I was actually in bed when I found out about it. My mother came in and happened to mention it. She bought me in a cup of tea because I was living at home, I was working, and I was about, I don't know how old I was, about 22, so I was fairly old for living at home. But there I was, bought in this cup of tea and happened to mention something about it. And I obviously, you know, you sort of double take, you don't really understand, it doesn't sink in, you're not very awake or whatever. So turn the radio on, and there's the music being played, etc. And you find out that it's actually true. Somebody that I grew up with, one of those bands I always associated with. There used to be that thing when you were either a Beatles fan or you were a Stones fan back in the 60s when I was a child. And although I've always appreciated the Rolling Stones music, the Beatles were always the ones that I appreciated more. I bought their albums. I've hardly bought any Stones albums, although I loved their singles, etc. So they were one of the big bands that always got me interested in music in the first place. One of the first bands that I ever remember seeing on the TV. Obviously they were so influential, so one of those ones that naturally you sort of latched onto, one of those ones that you heard, etc. I always remember seeing them on sort of the BBC programme Top of the Pops, and I remember my father happened to mention about how long their hair was long and all this sort of stuff, and that sort of instantly attracted me, being that sort of little rebellious streak that I've got in me as well. But one of the things that Ken happened to mention actually was about how John Lennon's death coincided with the release of the Double Fantasy album, which came out. And I remember buying some of Lennon's early albums, The Mind Games and Imagine especially, and I bought most of the singles, and I still have them, some of the singles as well, on vinyl 45s from all those days and all those times that I bought them when they came out. So I was that old, yes. And I remember hearing the music that came out. As Ken said, it was the first album that Lennon had released for about 6 years or even more than that. And there was that anticipation, and there was a big build-up. There was lots of advertising going on. There were lots of interviews. There was a famous interview done by a BBC DJ called Andy Peoples, who actually went over to New York City to do a pretty exclusive, pretty amazing interview with John Lennon, literally a few days before he died. I remember listening to that and all the stuff that was going on the BBC at the time about talking about that interview and how good it was to get it, etc., and the music that came out and the first couple of tracks that you heard off a Double Fantasy album. And I'll be perfectly honest, I wasn't particularly struck by them. I didn't think that they were that great. And the point that Ken made in his particular video is that sort of strange phenomenon that happens when somebody like that, somebody that's iconic, some of those big people in the music industry, and whether they, as Ken said, whether they be an artist, a writer, a filmmaker, actor, actress, that type of person, one of those people that is a global person, I suppose, a globally recognised in one art form or field or another. When they die, there's this sudden scrabbling to get all their music, and it all bigs them up. And I remember that the album, or I think it had been released in the over here in the UK, but certainly the first single had been Just Like Starting Over, I think the first single was. And I thought, yeah, it's okay, but it's not that good. And it wasn't doing that well in the charts. And then, of course, wallop, as soon as that happened, as soon as John Lennon died, it's straight back up. It's like the Michael Jackson phenomenon that's gone on now. And many, many others, Hendrix and all these people, there is always that idea that someone dies young, which I suppose John Lennon was. He was only about 40 when he died. Obviously, Michael Jackson was a bit older. You know, Hendrix was in, it was at 27, I believe, is that age where Kurt Cobain and all those people died at. I think Keith Moon was 27. Just about everybody who died at that age. Jim Morrison, I think, was 27. All died at that age. Very young people. And people latch on to them. They want to suddenly start buying their music as though it's suddenly going to disappear. And as Ken said, the 7th of December, no one was particularly interested, or apart from the obvious fans. And then come the 8th, everybody and their wife wants to get, the whole world wants to know about John Lennon, and they're digging into it, and the big media circus even then came into play, I think. So, and I think that's it's a bit something I'm never very happy with, because I suppose it's at point that the people who like these superstars or whatever, the people who died, the people who were there in the beginning, the people who were appreciating them even at the time that they died, when maybe they weren't quite as popular, they feel that they're their own, they're that person, and they're the people that are still making the videos now, like Ken and like possibly myself and others as well. They're the people who still feel it, even if I couldn't remember that. As soon as I read that tweet today, it brought all those memories back flooding to me before I saw Ken's video, and I just felt that I had to put my own little bit up here, my own little tribute. A couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to go over to New York City, and myself and my family were in Central Park, and I said, "Rob, I've got to go to Strawberry Fields. I've got to go and see the Dakota Building." I left them in there. They were sitting there in the park quite happily on their own, and I wandered off and looked at the Imagine sign at Strawberry Fields there on the floor, and I walked across to the Dakota Building, and it sort of brought it home to me even more that that's where that happened, and so those sort of memories keep coming back of that type of thing. But I always remember, it's one of those, where were you when so and so died? For people of my generation, although I was alive when Kennedy was Robert Kennedy, yes, certainly, but JFK was assassinated. I do remember that because I was about 5 years old, and I remember how the impact of that for the older generation, for my parents. But John Lennon was one of the first ones that really hit me, I think. I remember Hendrix, but I was too young to really appreciate it, I think. With John Lennon, that was the first one that got to me because I knew the music, I thought I knew the man as well, and the history, etc. The music was something that was in me, a big music fan before then and since as well. And as I said before, that was the one band that had been there right the way throughout my musical life, my musical existence, if you want, and they're still there now because they were so good. Lennon's music as well, but especially for me, for the Beatles. So, as Ken said at the end of his video, and a phrase probably that's just as worthy now and always will be, give peace a chance, for God's sake. John Lennon, rest in peace.